Lips touch 3 times in your pants. No, really, this is my review on the Laini Taylor's short story anthology called Lips Touch 3 Times. And this, I think, was this her first published work, or were the fairy middle grade books? Maybe they were published first, like the first one of those. I forget what they're called, but they look really cool. And they've got groovy artwork, and I think the artwork is also by her husband, Jim, who's here. And yeah, so this is an anthology of 3 short stories that are all fantasy based, and they center around or include the presence of a kiss that changes things or brings stuff about. And yeah, they're based on a myriad of different mythology and fairy tale lore and stuff, and there's excellent illustrations in here. I am admittedly very sad that I have this cover, mainly because that mouth doesn't make sense. I don't think that's human. And also the US paperback and hardback cover is Jim's artwork on the front, which I think is much more effective and means a lot more to have that rather than this random thing. But anywho, I was just happy to, it was a really random find in a bookstore at Dimmicks. Yeah, I found it in Dimmicks, which means it wasn't cheap, but I just stumbled across it and went, wah! And I thought, I'm going to grab this, A, because it's short stories, and I like me some short stories, and B, because I wanted to give Laini Taylor another chance, because I was angry about parts of her novel Daughter of Smoke and Bone. Parts of it. I did not hate the whole thing. In fact, I loved huge chunks of that book. I just hated the romance. Hated it. And that, like, put a big looming cloud over everything else that I loved about it. So, and when people think, oh, Renee, you hated Daughter of Smoke and Bone, you're such a whingy, whiny complainer person. I did in fact really like it. If I just ignored the romance, it was a fantastic book. So I thought I should give her another chance, because I'd heard a lot of good stuff about this. And I'm a lot more forgiving with the short story format when it comes to romance and the presence of insta-love, especially if it's got a fairy tale-esque feel, because as you know, fairy tales thrive on insta-love. That's kind of what we love and like to laugh at about them, the fact that, you know, it's just always the love at first sight thing, and there's never any build-up between the characters getting to know one another, they're just in love. So, because that's the traditional element of any fairy tale romance for the most part, you kind of just, it's an expectation, and it's like a given trope, and you know, something you have to tick off if you're going to do a fairy tale kind of story. It's nice when you can go past that and actually develop it, but it's to be expected, so I'm a tad more forgiving. Also, a short story format helps, because you just don't have the same amount of space with which to give characterization and development of a relationship and things, so the fact that things feel a bit more rushed or a bit more sudden makes more sense, given that it's a shorter story. Yeah, so I thought I might handle it a little better in these little tales, and I did for the most part. And actually, it's sort of funny, because even though there was certainly insta-love in these stories, especially the first one, there was some development going on as well, which I kind of found amusing. Okay, to be fair, there's development in Daughter of Smoke and Bone. I just didn't like what it was, because it was about past lives, and that stuff annoys me. Past life stuff, I should say, this isn't a spoiler, but there's certainly a lot of past life shenanigans going on in one of these stories. Just giving you a warning. If that tends to annoy you as like being the excuse for a romance developing, then I'm just letting you know. But I really did actually sincerely enjoyed the stories in this collection, and I do very much really like and appreciate Laini Taylor's writing style and her use of prose, and it's poetic without ever being purple and heavy-handed and things. It flows really well, and the imagery it creates especially is fantastic. Like, all 3 stories had very distinct images in my head, and they're still there, like watching a film. So that's always like a top-notch sign that, you know, I appreciate what the writer was able to conjure in my head. Added to which, you've got illustrations by her husband, so it's really cool. I'm not a graphic novel fan. I don't like the format of graphic novels comics. I like words. I like creating my own stuff in my head. And I prefer to read rather than look. But accompanying pictures every now and then, you know, like an illustrated book, are fine by me. So there's like graphic novel style pictures in here. that are really, really, really groovy and evocative, and rather than like directly inform what you see in your own head, I think they just complement. And I watched a really good interview actually, and I'll link it in the doobly-doo in my pants. It's quite a long interview, it's like half an hour long, and it's with Laini and Jim. And Jim said that he kind of constructed the illustrations to be sort of a prelude to the story, so you can get a bit of backstory prior to what's happening, as well as images that directly, you know, complement and go alongside the narrative itself, which I think is really cool. So yeah, and I like the colour scheme and the style of it, and I think it really works for the stories themselves. And the stories, what I did appreciate very much in Daughter of Smoke and Bone was the mythology in it, and the fact that it's taking a lot of different ideas from more obscure folklore and different cultures that we don't often focus on, or don't get as much focus as like the stock European or English like fairy tale lore things. And I really liked that in the final story in this one especially, which is Hatchling. It's the longest story by far in this one. It's almost novel-y, sorta. The first one, however, which I liked a lot, is Goblin Fruit, and it's directly based on Christina Rossetti's poem, The Goblin Market, which is very, 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 very famous. And it complements it really nicely. It's sort of a modern retelling of it in a way, and it doesn't end happy, which I think, that's not a spoiler either, because if you know The Goblin Market, if you know that poem, it doesn't end happy, that's the point. And I really appreciated that. I was worried, I'm like, oh, is she going to change it? Because then that wouldn't feel right, it just wouldn't be true to the spirit of that story. But it ended the way I think it should, and it was very brief but really effective and evocative, and I thought that's cool because I'm a big fan of that poem. Also, if you know Labyrinth, then you know a lot of the Fae lore. Do not eat their fruit, do not eat any of their food, because that's a no-no. Sarah, don't eat the flippin' peach. So yeah, I like that poem, and I like that, you know, that side of the laws about dealing with fairies. My favourite story out of the three in here, however, was the middle one, which is called Spicy Little Curses Such as These. What a weird title. And I just thought it was really groovy. It's kind of about, I guess, sort of the afterworld, like the underworld, kind of, but it's like incorporating Indian mythology into it. And it was just really cool. There's a romance that's quite heavy in it, but I still thought it was quite nicely dealt with, even though it was rushed, but it was quite sweet and sincere, and I just really liked, I wish that this one was longer, because I can't explain really why, but it was my favourite of the stories, and yeah, I just thought the images in my head, it was just conjuring some really awesome stuff, and the pictures are cool too. And yeah, I really liked the idea, and the characters were interesting, and yeah, it was good. It was probably my fave, yeah. And then Hatchling is the final story, and it's sort of kind of taking the notion of like changelings, the idea that Fae like to take children as their own to kind of keep as pets, but it's not dealing with Fae. They're demons of a kind, and yeah, it's the longest story, and it's got some interweaving like timelines going on and stuff. But it was certainly interesting, and I was curious about what the characters were doing, what their motivations were. And another thing that I liked is that even though there are some villains in these stories, there's also a lot of grey area in terms of good and bad, and where people stand morally with what they're doing, because their actions aren't always very nice at all, but maybe the intent wasn't necessarily to harm. And so I like that it's taking, for the most part, taking myths and fairy tales which typically have a black and white stance on things, and kind of sprinkling a little bit of grey into there, especially in the final book, Hatchling. I was actually surprised by where some of the characters ended up kind of sitting on the moral scale, so that was curious. And yeah, if you like a bit more substance to your short story format, then you'd probably really like Hatchling, because it is a great deal longer than the other two stories. But I'm really glad I picked this up, and I think it's good to break a reading funk. That's why I like short stories often. If you're in a reading funk, you can pick them up, and just because of their brevity and the fact that you have a selection to choose from within the one book, then I don't know, it tends to help, like, give me a little bit of an insert to, you know, slap on the head and go off and read more now. So yeah, I very much enjoyed this book, these little stories, and I do encourage people to pick it up if you can. I think it should be, I mean, heck, if I found it in Australia, you should be able to find it at a bookstore near you. And especially if you enjoyed Daughter of Smoke and Bone, which pretty much everybody did. Certainly see if you can grab this one. And yeah, if you're a mythology and fairy tale fan, I think you'll definitely appreciate it, and the artwork's really groovy as well. So, I would give it a very solid, I'll give it a very solid 4.5 stars out of 5. I'm really happy that I found it. So, yeah, that's Let's Touch 3 Times by Laini Taylor and her husband Jim.